So most of you will probably by now know who our watch are. You might have heard us referred to as the, let's take a deep breath for this, the Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children. We were launched a year and a half ago now jointly by the federal and state Victorian governments, and we're funded as part of the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children. So that's just to give you a sense of who we are. We're a national body. We're based actually 2 floors down in Queen Vic Women's Centre, but we're a national body, so focused purely on the primary prevention of violence against women across Victoria as a state, but also across the country more broadly. So that's just a little bit about who we are to put this in context. Just so you, I'm here to speak about the Respect for Relationships project. The Schools project is one of a number of children and youth focused projects we're undertaking this year and will be undertaking in future years. But our watch has actually really quite a large remit, and it's really not programmatically focused. One of the biggest things that we're tasked with doing by the government under the national plan is developing a national conversation around the prevention of violence against women, and that's through public advocacy and media, as well as through our programs. And the schools work will be of most interest to you here today, but there's a lot of other work that we do that supports the work that happens in schools and supports the advocacy in Victoria and nationally that we do as well around getting violence prevention on the national agenda in school settings. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the project, but we'll talk a little, I've got handouts actually, which I'll just leave on the table out there that are kind of about to give you some practical strategies as examples of how really we go about doing this work in schools, because it's got a slightly different focus than some other Respect for Relationships projects. I'm referring to it as a project quite specifically because we're not designing another program. We're using, as I'll talk about in a second, a curriculum that's been publicly released by the Department of Education and Training, then DECD, which is a Victorian curriculum, but it's really closely aligned with not only VELS but AusVELS. So it's something that can be used nationally as well. So we're not really talking about a programmatic focus. We're talking about a way of working, a way of community organisations supporting schools to work, and a way of encouraging schools to work differently around addressing the underlying causes of violence against women. So this is what I guess the authorising environment is for our work. What we know is that in order for prevention programs and prevention activities to be successful, this is based on some work that Sue Dyson did a number of years ago, an authorising environment needs to be placed. This work has been driven by the community sector for many decades, not only with schools, but really if we're going to get this into every single school in Victoria and nationally, we need education departments on board, we need federal governments on board, we need a whole raft of bodies who are kind of coming together and saying, look, yep, we've got a shared priority, we're all going to work together to try and figure out what our different roles are in this space and how we can get these things up and running. So we've got, as I said, a national plan, which is where we receive our funding from. We also have a state plan, which is where this particular project receives its funding from in Victoria. And one of the things that we're doing is working in really close partnership with the Department of Education and Training. Whilst the program is funded by the Department of Human Services, Education and Training are co-conveners of our reference group. They're, as I'll talk about a bit later, enabling us to use their offices to situate our watch staff in their offices so we can get some much closer connection. So we're really testing a model that hasn't, in terms of a partnership between education and community sector, that hasn't been tested in this context now. Previously in the early 90s, there was plenty of really strong partnerships around gender and gender equity with education regional offices and education centrally in the community sector, but that's kind of whittled off under the Howard government years, and so we're kind of coming back, hopefully, to a bit of a resurgence in that space. The project that we're running is being delivered in 3 local government clusters, which were selected by the Department of Human Services as a way to build on a previous project called Preventing Violence Against Women in Our Communities. And the reason that DHS was wanting us to work with schools in those regions is because, to some degree, capacity and understanding of prevention, of primary prevention in those local governments, in the community health sectors, in some of the schools, in a range of organisations in those local government clusters, had already been built through the 3 years of investment and work in the DHS funded project. And so we're wanting to try and figure out, is 3 years sufficient to get a whole lot of schools on board and putting their hands up and understanding that this is a really necessary thing? Do we need more, or hasn't it really made an impact at all? And that's one of the things that we'll be testing. And just to be clear, I'm not going to go into the evidence base because I think most of you probably know it, but this work has been developed based on academic research, based on schools practice research, based on the practice and theoretical knowledge of the vast range of community organisations, many of whom are in this room today, who have been undertaking violence prevention for a really long time. So this is, we're not kind of just a flash in the pan, I guess. This is really what we're trying to do, is to make sure that the evidence base we've got is as effective as it can be, to see what needs to be tweaked and to build on that for a national context. So this is the, with that green background representing our authorising environment, this is a bit of a model of the project, and I'm just going to talk through each of the little hexagons in turn. So stepping out is the curriculum that Tanya referred to. It has been released by the Education Department last year, and it's a Year 8 and Year 9 curriculum which focuses explicitly on preventing gender-based violence by addressing the underlying causes of that sort of violence. So it's really, really heavily focused on gender and the social construction of gender and what that means, and attitudes and concepts of power, as opposed to being an explainer of this is what violence is, which is what we kind of already do with kids. The second thing which I mentioned is a partnership with the Education Department. There's been I know that there's people in the Education Department in the room here today, and there's been a really significant shift. I've been working either within or with the Education Department for many years, and I think that there's been a really significant shift in the department itself, in regional offices and politically as well, and they're very much on board with this work. I know that there's concern amongst some of the members of community organisations, not only in Victoria but nationally, about governments taking over prevention work, and and some of those are really valid concerns, I think. But actually, we've got some really good committed people in the Education Department, and Tanya and the nursing staff are some really good examples of that, who get this stuff and who do this work with schools. And so, at a statewide level, I'm finding that quite encouraging. Anne and Joe, can you put your hands up for me, please? These are two of our 3 project implementation leaders who are tasked with leading the on-the-ground work in their areas. Anne is working out in the outer east, and Joe is working in the west, and we've got someone coming on board in the central Victorian area, which is our 3rd cluster that we're working with. So those staff, as I said, they're sitting within education regional offices, which is something that we've not tried before, and we're hoping that what that will do was enable much better connections between the kind of community sector organisation that our Watch is, the non-government focus, and the education sector, to get this on board. We've got that at a central level. Now what happens when you have that at a regional level? The projects will be working with up to 30 schools. I think we've got 26 on board at the moment, secondary schools only, across Victoria. And in each area we'll be working using 2 different models. One is a partner model, where schools are putting their hands up, an introductory model, where schools are putting their hands up to say, look, yeah, we really want to do this, but we're not really quite sure we've got a high level of capacity at the moment, so give us the curriculum, give us the PD, give us some level of support, and we'll see how far we get. So they're kind of being introduced to these concepts and doing some of the work. The other model is what's called a supported model, and that's where the PILs, the project implementation leaders, Anne and Joe, will play a really significant role in working directly with those schools to support them to have a look at the way, not only that, we've got a curriculum, but it's really what Joe and Anne will be doing is to be working with schools in partnerships to get the leadership on board, doing a lot of the similar stuff that I think secondary school nurses do around undertaking a whole of school approach and getting principals and school leadership, leading teachers to look differently at the way they deliver curriculum, but also at the way that they interact with students and what systems and structures around the school support or hinder gender equity. We've got a suite of professional development that's focused on, first, of course, training the teachers how to deliver the Stepping Out curriculum. The model that we use is a model where we feel, and the evidence shows, that teachers are best placed to be delivering curriculum because they've got the everyday relationships with those students. They know the class, they know the school. But we also recognise that there are some topics that staff feel quite uncomfortable delivering, which is why we've got some quite comprehensive 2-day professional development for them to access. And of course, the project implementation leaders and local community organisations who we're partnering with are there to support some of that in-class delivery if the topics are just too difficult for the teachers. The other aspect of the professional learning strategy, or the professional development package that will be piloting, and this is very much a pilot. The curriculum PD has been tested as part of a previous project. The second bit of PD I'm going to talk about is new, and it's looking at the school as a workplace, which is a concept I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But really what that's professional development is designed to do is to work with senior members of the school staff. Assistant principal and principal are kind of mandated to be there, as well as staff who are involved in leading school culture, whether that's their formal role or not, to skill them up to basically to have a gender lens, so that they can have a gender lens when they implement and draft new policies and procedures, when they think about how students are disciplined in the classroom, when they think about how VCE text is selected, a whole range of things. So what this curriculum is designed to do is to help principals think about their school as a workplace, because that's what it is. We just often don't think about it that way. We'll be utilising the parent body, although as you suggested, Tanya, that's really difficult, particularly in a secondary school context, and it's not likely we're going to have a great deal of luck, I don't think, but we'll be developing resources that parents can access to talk to their kids about some of the topics and issues that come up as part of delivery of the Stepping Out curriculum, and working with organisations who are within the school who have some influence on parents, like school councils. One of the big things I think that we'll be doing over this year and hopefully as our watch in the future will be working in partnership with community organisations and building the capacity of new organisations who are new to violence prevention work, who want to be working with schools but don't quite know what their role is. Local governments are a really good example of that. They've got a really strong passion and commitment to working directly with schools or having their youth workers support this work, but don't necessarily have the remit to be having a programmatic approach. So what we want to try and figure out is how we can support them to continue on in doing that work. The last two things that we'll be doing are to support the work of schools and to make sure that we're being mindful of the vast range of community organisations who are already doing this work and who are already doing it well. We'll be working in partnership with those. It's up to individual organisations to be putting their hands up if they're interested and if they're working with schools in the clusters that we're talking about. But I really do want to emphasise that this program is not about coming over and saying any of those programs that Tanya listed are irrelevant and let's not use them. This is about our best shot, I think, is to be using an education department sanctioned curriculum. It's what schools are comfortable with, it's what we know. We're developing PD around that, which will be publicly available next year. So what we're trying to do is to figure out how we can ensure that community organisations, how we can build a model to ensure that community organisations have got the adequate support they need to be working with schools using this model or something very similar to it if they have an interest in doing that. So moving on to the kind of the school as a workplace, it's an unusual way, I think, of looking at schools. People don't really think about it. This is just a really crude, given my poor PowerPoint skills, example of what you get when you combine the evidence base around preventing violence against women in school settings and preventing violence against women in workplace settings. Some of this, and particularly in terms of student-teacher relationships, is anecdotal because, you know, I can guarantee you that the vast majority of people in this room have struggled to get evaluation funding, as have I in previous programs, and so we don't really have any longitudinal data about the positive impact of violence prevention initiatives on student-teacher relationships, on student behaviour, student attitude and student outcomes. That's one of the things that the evaluation of this particular schools project is going to try and examine, to make sure that we're gathering data that helps us sell this message to school staff better, and to schools we need to be talking their language. Even though we think it's important, and it is, we also need to recognise that schools get a lot dumped on them, and so we need to be able to make a case for basically, you do this work well, it's going to make your lives easier, it'll make you more productive as teachers, it'll make your leadership teams more productive, your students will just be easier to teach. This is where I was going to get you to have a look at the handouts, but I won't. I'll just leave them on the table out the front. But basically, what I've got in those is some really practical examples of what we will be doing in schools as a way of getting principals to think about workplace violence prevention. So these kind of 7 dot points are the whole school approach that we're using. I find that when we talk about a whole school approach, what happens is principals and teachers immediately just go to, well, what does a whole school approach mean for the students? What we're trying to articulate is a whole of school approach in each of these areas means different things when you look at a workplace. It means conducting gender audits and pay audits. It means thinking about how you teach curriculum and who you call on in a classroom. Do you really call on, as a teacher, every single student equally? Do you need to enforce some positive discrimination in the classroom because you've realised that actually you call on all the boys? Do you ask the boys to just carry the sports equipment? These all sound like really minor things, but actually what happens is when you go into a classroom and deliver an amazing program and an amazing curriculum and then have all of those subtle messages around that are undermining what happens in the classroom, the kids don't pick it up. It doesn't sustain attitudinal behavioural change, and so that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to address. And so lastly, just to touch on the kind of the next steps, we are testing the current evidence base and building a new one, and building on the existing evidence base around schools and around workplaces in this context. Piloting PD, doing all the sorts of things that you would normally do in a project, but one of the biggest things that we're doing is being mindful of these sorts of programs happen a lot. They're government funded and they happen for a year, and then there's a little bit of chatter for another year, and then nothing else happens. Our Watch as a national organisation has got a 5-year commitment to working in settings which target children and young people. That's schools, or one of the settings that would target children and young people. And so what we want to be doing is making a case for government, and quite a practical case for not only the Victorian government but nationally. The reason we're doing it, having in the introductory and the supported model, is to see what happens when you really just give schools a little bit of PD and the curriculum and then leave them to sort it out for themselves, versus what happens when they have good, intensive expert advice and support in an ongoing way. What are the different outcomes for the school and for the student body? And so what we'll be doing as part of this is assessing the level of support that the project implementation leaders provide, but also that the range of community organisations provide, so we can put a figure on it. So we're not, again, asking community organisations to deliver this for free, to just work it into their core crisis service funding. So that's one of the biggest things we'll be coming out with. The other thing which you'll be able to look at for next year, which will be very much publicly available, is quite a comprehensive resource kit and very practically focused for schools, but about what else needs to sit around the curriculum. And so part of that will be a professional development strategy, but part of it will be a range of other tools and resources that schools can pick up and use as they see fit, supported by some of the people in this room. Thank you.